Hello, listeners. I'm Layla Maghribi. Welcome to Third Culture Therapy, a podcast that explores the ways culture and heritage impact our mental and emotional well-being. On today's episode, I'm thrilled to be joined by Yomi Adegoke, an award-winning journalist, author, and cultural commentator. Yomi's debut novel, The List, is a dramatic and incisive exploration of love, reputation, and the complexities of online life. It's a story with many plot twists, which I thoroughly enjoyed, but the central theme looks at what happens when private relationships collide with public accountability, and it asks who gets to be the online police. Before that, she co-wrote the book Slay in Your Lane, The Black Girl Bible, which looked at the experiences of Black British women in work, education, media, and relationships. Themes she went on to explore further in her podcast by the same name. Yomi, it's such a pleasure to have you here on the show.
Pleasure to be here. Thanks for having me.
Now, Third Culture Therapy, as the name suggests, explores culture and the ways it shapes our identity, but also our way of being and living in the world. And a lot of what you write about Black British culture does the same. Before exploring and unpacking some of the themes that we're both really interested in, I wanted to understand better your own identity, how you identify, what cultural influences you had growing up in the UK, and what that experience was like for you.
Firstly, I want to say, great podcast name. I love the name.
Thank you.
It's so catchy. So both my parents are Nigerian, Yoruba to be specific, in terms of the tribe that we are from. I very much identify as a Nigerian person, but also a Nigerian-British person, more specifically, a Black British person, and potentially sometimes at stretch a British person, certainly not an English person. Obviously, these labels are kind of like, they're kind of strange. Some things feel like they fit better on certain days, in certain places. But I think the identity that I feel very much like encapsulates me perfectly is Black British. I feel like when I was younger, like so many, third culture kids, I felt very sort of torn between, feeling like I wasn't British enough, and then also feeling like whilst I was obviously living in the UK, and then when I'd go on holiday to Nigeria, I'd feel like, oh, I'm not Nigerian enough. But I think, being part of this wave of mainly millennial kids that their parents came to the UK in the 80s and 90s, I feel like there's so many of us, and so many of us are shaping cultural conversations, whether that be in literature, whether that be in music, whether that be in film and television. I feel like my identity feels a lot less in flux now. I feel very, very comfortable and certain in my identity as a Black British person, in a way that perhaps when I was younger, I felt slightly more confused, if that makes sense. I felt slightly more, am I British enough? Am I African enough? And it's also interesting because I feel like we're very much seeing the rise of the far right again. We're seeing, back in when I was younger, there was a big NF population where I grew up in East London. And I feel like that has very much brought our British identity into question. But on the flip side, I actually, despite going to Nigeria and not speaking Yoruba and having a very different accent and having a very different sort of like culture or cultural experience, or like a kind of blended cultural experience, I actually found that when I am in Nigeria, when I've been in Nigeria, and when I am in Nigeria, like present day, regardless of those differences, an African person is always seen as an African person, if that makes sense. Like Nigeria on the continent will always say, regardless of where you grew up, regardless of what you do or don't speak, you are a Nigerian person.
Yeah, no, I completely relate to all of it. Like you, I've reached a point where I feel quite comfortable to be like, I'm British Arab and it's fine, and the two coexist, but it's not like an angsty, despite the political landscape, to the contrary. But at least internally, I don't feel too much of a difference. But I'm curious. You mentioned there's the Black Nigerian part, and then there's the Nigerian-British, and then there's the Black British. Within the Black British culture, how much differentiation is there based on which country of origin you're from, or does it, because in the end you're all Black, become that is the commonality, and where does that allow for the differences that exist?
I think that's such a thoughtful question. I think one of the reasons that I actually probably at times and again, it's always in constant flux, but probably identify even more heavily with the Black British label is because essentially of what you just said. So I grew up in Croydon, where I still live. I live in Thornton Heath, and the vast majority of my friends growing up were actually of Ghanaian origin. Ghanaian culture and heritage and identity really heavily shaped my life all the way from like primary school up till now. For instance, there is a really popular music genre called high life, and the Ghanaian version of that is hip life. And I grew up mainly because of my friends listening to hip life and high life. And even to this day, when I'm in groups of Ghanaian people, they're usually like quite surprised by how much of a connection I have with that music. The fact that there are certain bits of the language tree that like I can kind of understand. Like I certainly cannot understand the language, but they're just little kinds of phrase that I'm aware of. There are certain like just cultural elements that I have a massive affinity with and exposure to. And then I'd say very much it was a similar experience for me when it came to the Caribbean and specifically Jamaican communities. So when I was in college, pretty much most of my earliest like sort of party experiences were at Jamaican sort of dancehall raves.
Yes.
So I got very used to going out at like, parties starting at like 12 o'clock at night and me getting home at like 6. Don't know how my mum was allowing that to happen.
Wow.
I was going with my sister, so somehow she thought it was fine. But grew up very much listening to a lot of like bashment, a lot of dancehall, as so many Black British, regardless of where your parents and ultimately you are from. So I think through the music, through things like even experiences like Notting Hill Carnival, the fact that that's a very much a British tradition, but within the community we very much honor it as a Jamaican like and Caribbean tradition. But these days they have sound systems that play Afro beats and music of African origin. So yeah, I'm super proud of, for instance, someone like my friend Rennie Lodge, who's of Nigerian and specifically Yoruba heritage, and like Emma Dabiri, they've got literally the same heritage as me. That being said, I'm equally as proud when someone like Stormzy, like I'm seeing Stormzy on TV or seeing actors that don't necessarily have the same heritage as me. I feel like it's all part of us winning, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
What I will say is I believe this exists despite the best efforts of some bad faith actors. So I would say that I'm sure you have heard of the term the diaspora wars, and I'm not going to completely sugarcoat it and I'd be so idealistic as to say that there are not there's not mutual stereotyping between groups. I do think that there is a level of division that's being sown, I'd say almost more recently over the past few years, like online, when obviously identity in every sense of the word has like sort of become, for better or worse, something that people focus on a lot more. And I would say that like, again, even pre-internet, they're definitely, if we're going to talk about differences, being African certainly in the like 90s was not considered a cool or fashionable or chic thing. That's very much something that's changed, I think, through fashion, through music. I'd say Afrobeats has certainly played a huge part in that. I think like fashion and I would say that Nigeria has quite specifically been at the forefront of that, primarily because there are just so many of us. Country, with a lot of people in it, but that every single nation I feel has played their part and pushed the Africa on the map, so to speak. But when I was growing up, I remember actually thinking for a very long time I was one of the only Nigerian people that like I knew, because so few people would come out and say they were Nigerian. Really? Often you'd meet lots of people that would say, "Oh, I'm part Jamaican," or "I'm half Ghanaian and I'm half Jamaican," and it was only as we got older I realized, oh, that person was actually Nigerian. Like I'm very lucky that my parents very much instilled a big pride in my identity, so I never felt it was something I needed to obscure. But yeah, those differences did exist, where being Caribbean was considered like the cool thing, and I think being African was seen as almost slightly embarrassing. And I think that's probably because the Windrush was taking place in the 50s and 60s, so the culture had like kind of assimilated, but it took a little bit more time for the mainstream to kind of mesh with African culture in the UK.
Yeah.
Sorry, the answers are so long.
No, it's great. It's great. I mean, it's really interesting to understand all the nuances. And as you're listening, I'm sort of transposing a bit of it onto like Arab culture and seeing there's a lot of similarity there. There are 22 different Arabic speaking countries. And yes, there are these different cultures and nations, albeit, some of them are very like new nations, let's say, and historically there was more territories that were together. But regardless, I find though that when they're then in diaspora and abroad, ultimately you just see that, well, actually, we're kind of the common thing in two ways, both the common experience, there's a lot of common experience, but also the commonality in the way that you are seen and perceived in your host country, right? And I think that's also a big part of it. And I imagine that's also a very big part of being Black. It's like, we can pick apart like Ghana and Nigeria, but at the end of the day, when we're here and walking down the street or dealing with our boss, or they're not asking, they're not differentiating.
Jollof rice is better. Exactly. That's not really, that's
not what it's about.
Exactly. I completely agree. And I think it's something that, as I said, I do think it's something that, like, frustratingly, like, the conversation is sometimes being like deviated from that. Like, I do feel like sometimes people are really trying to pick apart our differences, and there is a lot of stereotyping and all that kind of stuff. But everything you said, I completely agree with. I think ultimately there is just something unifying. Even when you look at the sort of ethnic makeup of an area like Croydon, I feel like my parents didn't necessarily move here because they were thinking there were a lot of Nigerians here. I think it was very much there were a lot of Black people here. That was it was at the forefront of their mind.
Have you heard of the silk hair wrap company Paradise Fold? I've been using their 100% silk double-layered reversible wraps and turbans for years. And if you love your hair, I think you're really going to love these too. Beautifully designed, snug, and luxurious, they're the ticket to hydrated, healthy, frizz-free hair. Third Culture Therapy podcast listeners get a special 10% discount on the Paradise Fold website with the code TCT10. Your book, Stay in Your Lane, it was a significant moment as well for Black representation and having these honest conversations about what it means to be a Black British woman specifically in modern Britain. When you look back at that now, 7 years later, why do you think it resonated, I know, so powerfully? Why?
I think actually we were really intentional about, so me and Elizabeth are both Nigerian. We could have been like, well, we're both Nigerian women from South London, really similar experiences. But she grew up in Peckham, which is just a stone's throw away from where I am. So we could have really said like, this is going to be about the Nigerian-British female lens. But again, it's a specificity that we just didn't think mattered. If there were maybe hundreds of books that were putting the Black British female experience under a microscope in 2018, maybe a Nigerian-British like angle wouldn't feel superfluous. But at the time, the reason the book actually came about is because we were like, wow, all the books that kind of talk about the Black female experience, they more tend to be like academic works. And we were like, wow, all the ones that we can come across that are a little bit more self-help, for lack of a better phrase, or like guide to life-ish, they were all American. And then all the things that we're looking at the experience of British women more generally, not speaking specifically about Black women, essentially we're speaking about white women. So we were incredibly intentional about saying this has to speak to as many types of Black women we can think of. So we spoke a lot about diversity within diversity. So, in terms of what jobs these women were doing, but also in terms of what country these women's parents were from, what their heritage was. We didn't want it to be every single woman that we've spoken to is a Nigerian woman, is an African woman. We were really intentional about making sure that there was as much Caribbean representation as possible. We also wanted to ensure that, it was diverse in terms of class, because there are some women in our book that are, for instance, like privately educated. There are many that are not. And I think one of the most crucial things that we were really, really trying to make sure we were able to do was to make sure that not every single Black woman featured in the book was from London, because obviously that is where the vast majority of the Black population is situated. But there are also places like Birmingham and Manchester that have massive Black British populations. So we really wanted to make sure that that was something that we worked on featuring as well. And I think that's why it resonated so powerfully, primarily because we were genuinely diverse in, definitionally. And I think a lot of women felt that, even in the conversations we have within our communities, maybe they don't feel necessarily seen or heard. For instance, if you aren't from London, or if you aren't working in a certain profession. So I think it made a lot of women feel seen. But then I also feel like it genuinely just wasn't something that I don't think anyone had really seen before, certainly not in the UK. It was, yeah, I think it was kind of ahead of its time, humbly. I mean, it wasn't even my idea, it was Elizabeth's idea.
It was. I mean, it was, I was going to say it was ahead of its time, although at the same time, it seems odd to say that because surely
it should have been done 30 years before.
Why? Like,
Yeah,
why
100%
wasn't there?
agree.
I mean,
100% agree.
And I want to dig into a little bit, a couple of points you made. One, the distinction between the British and the American experience. And then also to ask you, diverse as the representation was, did you find common strands, common themes? And if so, what were they?
Absolutely. So I think it's actually really interesting when you sort of speak about the African American experience, because for so long, the only way that most Black people growing up in the UK were able to see themselves like visually represented rather through the media was via American media. So things like Sister Sister, Keenan and Kel, Moesha, Fresh Prince, exactly. There was a lot of commonality within the Black British experience and the Black American experience. But again, it was of course super different. Yeah. For instance, like even when you look at like the Fresh Prince of Bel-Air and you look at like the representation of like a class conversation, right? Like that was meant to be a very middle class family. Same with the Cosby Show. These were very, very middle class representations. And that's not to say that there wasn't a Black middle class like in the 1990s in Britain, but it was certainly a lot smaller. And also like it was far less likely that you'd have kind of a Black middle class that was so in and of itself, if that makes sense. So if you were a Black middle class person, you're going to private school where you're boarding alongside white kids, Asian kids. But what I always found really interesting was, wow, it's like their whole world is Black in a way that doesn't exist in the UK. It's like, you know, it's everything so mixed. Like as much as I live in a very Black quote unquote area, I mean, you get on a bus and it's literally people from across the globe. And I think that's quite interesting. So there were just lots of differences, even in terms of the way racism is expressed in the UK. It tends to be slightly more covert, slightly more passive aggressive and underhand. So I think it's only just really in, I say, this most recent generation, we've actually started to see stories that very specifically reflect the Black British experience. Even the thing of like, you know, Black Americans, I guess there are generational difference between their parents and children, but they're from the same culture. But like you're from a different culture to your parents, as am I. And that creates a whole new dynamic. So yeah, I think it's really interesting with the conflation of the African American and Black British experience. I think it's something that's ongoing, but I think it's something that in recent years has developed. Like we have gotten so much further from when I was growing up, where there was just no conversation around the specificity of I'm a Black British person at all.
Just to your point, I think also part of the reason why perhaps that conversation is happening or it's matured is also because of the point you made about cultural representation and the fact that there are many more Black British artists that have prominence in and of their own right. You know, you mentioned Stormzy earlier. Point. That has allowed for, again, like, oh, there is a distinct identity actually 100%. Here. I still think there's a lot to be said that needs to be said that isn't said 100%. And like unpacked. But at least, it is no longer this given, like the Western Black experience is American. Yeah, no.
Exactly that. And I think also just to your point, like, those artists, people like Dave, people like Stormzy, TV writers like Michaela Cole. What's so interesting as well is that back in the day, a lot of these conversations that were happening, I think they were like intra-communal. So for instance, like I grew up on grime music. I grew up watching like a music channel called Channel U that then rebranded as Channel AKA. I grew up, watching like SBTV and Link Up TV and stuff like that. So a lot of the conversations that were happening felt very much like they were just happening within the Black British community. Like if you knew, you knew. Whereas I think what's really interesting is like Stormzy, Michaela Cole, Dave, these are some of the most famous people in the country. So it's kind of just people outside of the community to understand how, vast and diverse the Black British experience is. How it's kind of being stitched into the fabric of British society in a way that it just wasn't before. It just felt so, like I remember it was like So Solid Crew when I was growing up, huge deal, and these kind of felt like one-off things, Craig David, stuff like that. Whereas now it's like you don't blink at the modern day equivalents like in the mainstream anymore. And in terms of commonalities and common themes, I think that's partly why I'd say I really love the like banner of Black Britishness. I think what was so like kind of affirming was just how much commonality there was. So, and not just, you know, from women that are different class backgrounds, different careers, like generationally. That's why I actually found like kind of bittersweet, because you're talking to Margaret Busby, who was the youngest and first Black female publisher in the country, and she's now in her 80s. And then you're speaking to, you know, someone like Jamelia, the pop star, and they are an entire generation apart, but so many of their experiences just intersected or just were completely parallel. So many of the stereotypes that like these women faced, so many of the hurdles that these women had to, you know, surmount. Like, yeah, it was affirming, but then also quite sad, because you realize like in many ways how much work there still was to do.
Hey, are you enjoying this episode? Well, let us know. In fact, better yet, let others know by sharing the show with them. Follow Third Culture Therapy Pod on Instagram, YouTube, and Substack, and listen to the show on all the usual channels. Now, where were we? You said bittersweet, and like the sweet part, presumably, maybe I'll let you confirm this, but was having that commonality and maybe sensing the emergence of a bit of a like collective or tribe or less people that you feel less alone in that experience, and giving voice to that. And the bitter part being, obviously, as you said, that it still exists. But then I want to ask you, more bitter to that, perhaps, is that a couple of years after you that book came out was then the somewhat infamous Sewell report. That was a government commission to look at racism, and that basically came out with this conclusion that there was no longer racism in the UK on an institutional level. Everything was fine now, and we were, you know, good to go, Black and white, equal across the board, which obviously caused a lot of controversy because most, I would like to think most sane, but just reflective people would have thought that's not quite true. But how did that make you feel, seeing that?
I feel like we'd always set out to, our aim was very much that we want to write this and it to almost at some point in the future, hopefully nearer future than later, that it would be a relic, that it'd be something that people read and were like, whoa, this feels so archaic and so different from how things are right now. And that's always been our goal. We've always said that like we want to have daughters and our daughters to read it and not relate. That's what we've always wanted. And I think, I remember hearing that news and just feeling, well, I don't feel like given that that's what we wanted and that was our goal, I was like, I definitely don't feel that this is something that I could pass on to, you know, any person younger than me at all, and they'd read it and go, wow, what a crazy time that was. It's been an interesting few years. I feel like many people who'd never had to contend with the concept of racism before, or hadn't really thought about it, or who had thought we lived in a, you know, post-racial colorblind society. I think post-2020, it forced a lot of people to have a good, long, hard look in the mirror and a good, long, hard look at society. And I think after that, there's been this real desire to just kind of declare that everything is fine now.
So, but like it's like the racist equivalent of spiritual bypassing. Like,
oh no, I don't know what that means.
Spiritual bypassing. You know, when people go on a journey, like an inner journey, self-development, spirituality, and they're all like learning and this and that, and then there's a period where, you know, the ugly stuff comes out. Maybe the so-called shadow work, or we can just think about your repressed stuff. Shadow work is kind of a bit of a like spiritual term for just basically dealing with your shit. But then people kind of, instead of going into that and really unpacking it and kind of going through a bit of the difficult, nasty, self-confronting, awkward, shameful feelings and then coming out the other end, they kind of like skip past it and go into like, the world is beautiful and let's just love one another.
I did the work. Yeah,
like we can just love one another.
Yeah,
it will be fine.
Yeah, I think that's where we're at, which is actually ironic because I think it's kind of like also coinciding with you've got two camps almost. You've got the people that are being like, we've come out the other side, everything's fine. We've acknowledged that things maybe weren't, but everything's fine now. And then you've got the people who are like, I really didn't like having to think about that stuff. So now we're dealing with the backlash where some people are just wanting things to revert back to how they were before. And you've kind of seen this like real shift in, in politically, you're seeing people veering further and further to the far right. It's actually been really interesting because I've seen people who through, I'd say over the last 5 years, maybe more, like 7 years, basically like since the book came out, and the other books that discuss things like this, like Reniero Lodge's Why I'm No Longer Talking to White People About Race. It's been interesting seeing people who had such kickback against those conversations now declaring that actually, no, yes, racism is real, but it's actually anti-white racism that's a thing. These are people that denied that, do you know what I mean? These are people that denied racism was ever an issue. So yeah, I think we're in a really strange time where I think it'd be actually intellectually dishonest to suggest that there, over the past however many years, haven't been massive strides made. And I don't think anyone, I think most people would even argue that that wasn't the case. But I think there are lots of people who are taking those strides. And as you said, with that brilliant example of people that, kind of don't really want to do the work, but want the outcome, you've got these people going, oh, see, it's all fixed, without looking at the data that shows how much like things have actually slipped right back. And then you've got other people that are like, I don't even want to have that conversation at all. I actually prefer that things just revert to, pre-2020.
Yeah. And I mean, I can be sympathetic to a certain extent that it's, it's painful, it's uncomfortable work. So I get why there is an instinctive resistance to it. Like, no, I don't want to go there. But then I end, the sort of sympathy kind of drops after it, partly because I'm like, well, I had to go through it. You had to go through it. So many of us who are racialized and who have felt discrimination in one way, shape or another, there was no choice. I wonder for you, like doing that work and then seeing not only that it still exists, racism, but now you're also being gaslit into being told that it doesn't actually. So you're on both ends. There's how do you deal with that, the emotion, your mentally, that sort of like, first I'm being harmed and now I'm also being told that I'm not being harmed. But I also have to go out there in the world and sort of advocate and explain to others. And how is that for you?
I remember me and Elizabeth at length in interviews would often say that we don't want these conversations to be trend-led, because when things are trends, if something's in fashion, it has to fall out of fashion, at some point. That's literally how it works. So I did kind of fear that at some point we might regress and take like a couple of steps forwards and a couple of steps backwards. But I think, speaking to your other question of, what the sweet has been in the bittersweet, I think we are used to, as a community, being the only people that really care about certain things. I think we're used to having it. Like, I think that's the beauty of the fact that the book exists, because I feel like I'm really grateful that it was able to be published. I'm really grateful that it received the response it did, because, whilst lots of white managers, decided that they wanted to buy it to kind of better understand their team and their staff and XYZ. And whilst that's great, and whilst that's what we wanted, if, the numbers of people outside of the community have dropped because it's not necessarily in vogue to have those conversations outside of our community anymore, we know that these are conversations that will always matter within our community. And I think it's really worth stressing that's literally why we wrote it. Lots of books, lots of anti-racist books, understandably center white people and whiteness. And I don't say that as a critique. It's something that's completely necessary as we all live in this world together. And in the same way that men need to be part of the fight for feminism and should be, people of all races need to be part of the fight against racism, essentially. But when we were writing Slay Your Lane, the reason we wanted it to exist is because we noticed that there weren't any works that were speaking specifically to the Black British female population in that way. So we were very much like, if you decide that as someone who is not part of this community, you want to sort of come along for the ride, we'd love that. That's great. That's amazing. But that's not what we set out to do. It's like a wonderful byproduct of what we were trying to do, which was essentially to speak directly to Black women about their experiences, to make Black women feel seen, to make Black women feel heard, and to also just make Black women realize that we're not alone. And this is stuff that's happening to all of us. And essentially, we always say, we really balk at the phrase like self-help, because we always say, we used to say, you can't slay your way out of systemic racism, you just can't. But we wanted it to be a guide, because ultimately we wanted to say, look, even if, there are people that don't care about what you're experiencing, this is how you can try to navigate this system to the best of your ability and essentially live a better and happier life. It was very much for Black women, as opposed to just being about Black women.
Yeah. Absolutely. I think to your point, it's also an empowering way, right? It's a form of empowerment as well as like comradeship, I would also say, which I do think ultimately is a lot of the way to dismantling racism and systemic racism. I hear your point as in, yes, okay, we can speak to the perpetrators or the dominants, but I think to take the title of Audre Lorde's book, the master's tools aren't going to break down the master's house. That's not how you kind of actually have to empower 100%. The people who are the ones who eventually are going to be in a situation where they're like, actually, no.
Yeah, completely agree.
No, I'm not asking for permission anymore.
Exactly that. And I think that's why we were so hell-bent on calling it the Black Girl Bible. And I will never forget that we remember thinking like, should we Trojan horse it? Do we call this like just Slay Your Lane and then people pick it up and go, wait, this is about Black women. Like, is that what we're going to do? Or do we loud and proud say this is a book for Black women, by Black women, about Black women? And we decided to really lean into the latter and say, we chose that subtitle, the Black Girl Bible, because we wanted it to be clear that this is who it's for. It's actually fascinating how many women that are, racial minorities, but not Black, have actually read Slay Your Lane and felt like it spoke to their experience as well. Yeah. Of course, how many Black men have said that it spoke to their experience in some way. So, yeah.
And then you went on and wrote another incredible book, a fiction book, very different style, obviously, but still very much centering the Black British, now not just female, but the Black British experience. Obviously, we're going to talk about, you tell me more, but I'll summarize that it's essentially about a Black British power couple on the eve of their engagement, and they as they're announced, I think, their engagement and celebrating, a list goes up online on X or the equivalent thereof, like a social media site that basically outs a number of alleged predators and abusers, among them the male in the relationship, the fiance. And then it's just everything, chaos ensues. Yeah. But really it's a look at like online life, critique who gets to police who, accountability, responsibility. Obviously, nonfiction has been your bread and butter for years. Yeah. Journalist, columnist, write for The Guardian, write for Vogue. What made you decide you wanted to go down the fictional route, and why this topic?
Lockdown is why I decided to go down the fictional route. So I'd had the idea in 2017 to look at the very then prevalent phenomenon of these, online viral lists that would accuse people anonymously, usually men, of certain things. And I remember feeling, I guess at first, like completely on board with the process, and really very much like my knee-jerk reaction was just that like it was inherently a kind of like necessary, not even necessarily necessary evil. I saw it very much as a fundamentally net positive thing. And then I think as time went on, I guess mainly just as a journalist, to be honest, given the level of Ofcom regulation that there is when I was, working at Channel 4 News, when you're looking at how much has to go into, fact checking and all that kind of stuff before you publish a story. I think maybe on a more ethical level as a journalist, I did feel slightly conflicted. But I never pretended that I had any of the answers. I just knew that for me, it wasn't an immediate, yes. It was kind of like, okay, I would like to unpack this and explore this. And I wonder if is there anyone else like me that kind of feels a bit, unsure about the matter. So I was going to do a non-fiction, hopefully long read on it.
Yeah.
Like picture for The Guardian. But it just felt like there was just still too much heat in the issue. There wasn't enough distance to be able to write about it in a kind of really balanced way. So I shelved the idea for 3 years. Actually, no, I think 2 years. So I came back to it as a play. The less said about that, the better. I'm not a playwright, I don't think. So I left it again, and then it was lockdown. And quite literally, I say this all the time, that everyone was baking sourdough bread. Everyone was it was a lot of culinary, there was a lot of culinary content on my social media. Right. Content. And I am not a cook. And that's very much, again, where my identity, my Black, British, Nigerian specifically identity is in flux, because it's the fact that I'm, a 34-year-old woman of Nigerian heritage that cannot cook feels very, very atypical, and probably would not be the case had I grown up in Nigeria. But anyway, I digress. So it was lockdown, and I was like, well, I can't cook. But I do want to do something. And I would like to kind of use this time to just, do something that would be fun and interesting and enjoyable. And I'm big on hobbies. I feel like people should have more hobbies, and they should be more valued in society. So I really honestly wasn't writing it initially as a thing. I just kind of wrote it as I have this idea. I want to see. It was more like a test. Can I do this?
Yeah.
And for me, it felt like a really definitely not easy topic to write about. But because I knew I specifically wanted to make the characters, reflect the world I grew up in and live in now, I was like, you know what? This is a great. If I am a novelist, I'll find out through this, because it's a world I know really well. So I just kind of wrote it out of, lockdown was awful, but I mean, I just wouldn't have written the novel. Honestly, I don't think I've ever written it if it wasn't for that.
Wow. And did you, in the process of writing it, you said you kind of shifted your perspective on the initial view of these sort of online dumps or accusations, that initially you were all for it. Then you sort of were a bit question mark. Did those questions get answered for you as you were writing, or did you still have the questions at the end? Where do you stand on people piling on to people online? Well, maybe I'm sure you're not a fan of the pile on, but just generally using the online world to hash out their problems.
I have those exact questions genuinely to this day. I think a lot of people felt uncomfortable with the work because it wasn't clear what my opinion was. But I'm I
think that's exactly what makes it such a good novel, personally.
Thank you so much.
It's because it's really, and I'm all for I'm all about the nuance. Nuance. I don't know if that's just a writerly thing. I think I don't really think you can be a good writer person if you're not interested in the in-between bits. That's real life. It's not actually clear cut. It is a bit messy.
It's not online. That's the thing. Online, it's not real life.
Not real life. That's a good point.
Exactly. Real life is grey. Online life is black and white. And I think people, especially on issues like this, they want you to be incredibly didactic. They want to know that you are you are with the good guys. But life is just far more complex than that. And, I blame everything on my star sign. I'm always I'm a Libra, I'm a Libra, and we're all about balance, and we're all about nuance and back and forth thing and being indecisive. So for me, I had lots of questions going in. And honestly, I don't really feel... I don't actually think I answered any. All I would say is that, the one thing I was certain of when I started writing the book was that something can absolutely have great intentions, but anything can be weaponized. And that's something, I think that's probably my clearest kind of the only real solid opinion I have, which is that when it comes to that approach to justice and accountability, I completely understand it more than people would realize, that like why people feel the need to, you know, have this tool that has been able to hold even like brands and companies. Like, you know, back in the day, you know, something's faulty, you're having to like, you know, go into the store and XYZ. Now you can just drag them on social media.
Yeah.
Even like, you know, TV shows, if people feel like, you know, this is problematic in some way, you're able to hold people accountable. I completely understand why people would want to do that. That doesn't mean that, you know, it can't be weaponized and it can't be used in a way that is ultimately harmful and harmful to people that generally might be innocent and not have done anything. So yeah, it sounds like a cop-out, but honestly, I feel like it's one of the reasons I loved writing it, because I just was like, you know, even as a journalist, often I go into like interviews and getting ready to speak to people, and people contain multitudes, and it can be interesting going in expecting to have a conversation with someone and for it to go one way, and then you know kind of come out of it thinking, oh, that's not what I expected. And I think those most interesting conversations I have, those most interesting pieces that I've done, and yeah, I think the list is very much that. I can't imagine writing anything that felt very clear. I like
what's your relationship like with the online world now? Obviously, you've spoken about them in terms of reputation, but even more so. But just like general mental health, obviously, that's what we're interested in here.
I think I'm actually quite good at navigating the online world, just because I'm such a boundaried person, full stop. I love a boundary. So, for instance, when it comes to social media, like as soon as the number of people that started following my Instagram and my Twitter outnumbered people that I knew in real life, like literally to me, it was just such a knee jerk, such an instinctive thing. I was like, oh, okay, I'm going to stop posting certain things then. I'm not going to post as much about my family. Like, I think, you know, most people would probably assume I had just been single for like a decade, because I just never would post anytime I've been in a relationship. I just won't do it. So I think I actually feel like really quite comfortable, like for instance on Instagram, because like I know what I'm there to post. I know that for me, I think it actually maybe is more complex for people that don't use social media like very specifically for their work. So for me, I know what I'm there to do on Instagram. Like, yes, I am monetizing myself, and yes, I am selling myself because I have books to sell, and I have like, you know, it's literally part of my job. Sometimes I'm paid to post, so it makes sense to me. For a long time, I actually didn't really like Instagram as a platform, so I just thought like, why do people need to see these things? Whereas now I think having a very clear use, which is I use this for work, really has helped me draw very clear lines and boundaries. And goodness me, when I was on Twitter, my gosh, I'd constantly be subject to pylons, whether it's by, you know, racists who didn't like something I said in The Guardian, or people that just only read headlines of things, or, you know, like, and therefore ran with that and got really angry. And then when that just became, I think when I knew, okay, I'm writing this book, and I knew that it would be a very divisive topic. I just was like, and then obviously Twitter got bought by Elon Musk and became X. I was just like, I'm just not going to use this anymore. So I really don't tweet. And if I do tweet, it's quite literally me retweeting stuff for promotional purposes. So
yeah, I completely get what you mean about the online world. It made a big difference to me when I did that mental rejig of like, this is for work and therefore approach it as a job. I also went off X because it just gave me like too much anxiety. And I was like, what for? I don't need, like, this isn't. Do you find that writing, also being a writer, it kind of allows that processing of certain things for you? And are there other ways that you mentioned boundaries, but are there other ways that you look after your mental, emotional well-being? And are any of them things that you find more especially tied to your cultural heritage or to the Black experience generally?
Oh, I mean, I do love comfort food.
I think that's a universal experience. Nice try, Yomi.
I love a bit of comfort food. But I was going to say specifically, I live really close to two, like I have a very high Deliveroo bill, but I live really close to a Nigerian food shop, and like I'm also between that and like two, maybe three different Jamaican shops. There's another like Ghanaian shop on the high street. So I feel like the only way I tie it to my heritage is just, I guess, the specific comfort foods that I eat. I mean, to be fair, I tend to eat African food almost every single day, but I feel like that would probably be, as you said, it's a really universal experience, but I feel like it's maybe the foods that I eat that you know, provide a certain level of comfort, because there's something quite grounding about like African food.
Oh no, that's fair. I thought you were like comfort food, like
no.
carbs. I was like, yeah, we all like a carb.
I was gonna say, like, I feel like part of the reason, and again, I don't know if it's necessarily about blackness, but I guess like, you know, my area. So I live in Thornton Heath, and you know, it's kind of objectively considered like a shithole, and it's not something I'm precious about, because I'm like, it is a shithole, but it's my shithole, and there's a reason I live here, because you know, my best friend and co-author lives like 20 minutes away from me. My godson and my best friend live like 15. My sister lives across the road. My parents, I can walk 20 minutes to my parents' house. So I think what's actually been really grounding has been, obviously, in this industry, which is all quite like flighty and glamorous and, you know, whatever. It's actually really grounding. Like, you know, I still go to the same doctor that I had a baby. So I think it's always quite grounding and quite like, yeah, in a way that I actually really appreciate. So I have no aims of leaving this shithole anytime soon.
You have your community.
Yeah, very much so. Very, very much so.
Yeah. No, I get that. That's beautiful. That's really beautiful. Actually, one last thing. Do you have a book in the works? Something for us to look out for?
I have a book in the works. I have just handed in my first draft. It is so different from the list. I mean, it's still quite satirical. It's still quite tongue-in-cheek. And it is definitely divisive again, because I don't like to make life easy. It's got a lot of nuance. But as a spoiler, I'll just say it does not take place in the world I grew up in at all. It actually takes place partly in Africa, to be fair, but also in America. So it's a very different vibe. Yes, I'm having to really, really stretch my novelist muscles, because I'm having to really put myself in shoes that I genuinely have not been in before.
Okay, exciting. Well, good luck.
Thank you so much.
I look forward to reading it.
Thank you. I had such a great conversation. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Bye.
I would love it if you would like, follow, and review this episode. And please share it far and wide with friends, family, colleagues, the lot. Every little click from you helps elevate this podcast, allowing me to carry on producing great content for you.